Figures of the fog. Fog, a dense accumulation of tiny water droplets, suspended in an atmosphere close to the Earth's surface, which obscures or restricts vision. That was exactly what Joshua and I were looking at. "My God," Joshua uttered quietly as he walked away from his car, forgetting to lock it. "Matt, what are we looking at?" he said to me, without taking his eyes off what was in front of him. "It looks like fog, I think," I answered, hesitantly. Not even I was sure about the situation. It looked different from what you would usually see. Luckily, we weren't alone. Gwen and Sam finally took the courage to step outside the automobile. Sam staggered, taking in the view what was in front of him. "Have they built a wall around the hometown or something? Matthew, is this why you called us yesterday?" "That's not a wall, Sam, although I'm not sure what it is," Gwen spoke up, following her lover. And she was right, it wasn't a wall. Yet, from afar, it would look like one. The fog seemed to have entirely blocked the view of the village. Though that wasn't all. Looking left and right, it seemed to go on and on. Almost as if only the town was chosen to be engulfed by the white curtain. None of us had been able to contact our friends or family that still lived there. It had been like that for days. Eventually I grew worried, thinking something might have happened to my sister. Joshua, Gwen, and Sam seemed to face the same distress. So we decided to meet up and check out what was going on for ourselves. Looking at the amount of police cars who were parked at the side of the road, you could understand how worried all of us were. "It's definitely not a wall, but I think we should go inside and see for ourselves," I responded. Gwen stormed at me and clutched the collar of my shirt. "Look at the amount of cars that are standing just outside the town, Matt. Sam and I have counted at least 5 police cars. All empty. Either they're already getting help as we speak, or something happened to those officers." Even though she was right, something felt off about the situation. Maybe it really was a crazy idea to go inside, but as stubborn as I am, that did not hold me back. Yanking my shirt free, I wanted to answer. But just before I could, Josh cut me off. "That is a great idea and all, but I think you should come and look and check this out." Josh had been toying around with one of the cars. If the police was inside, and the car was outside, maybe there was a way of communicating with the officers, I thought to myself. "What do you find?" Sam asked as we walked up to him. "Static. All of the radios in the cars are giving nothing but static noise." There was worry in his voice. Sam took the two-way radio out of Josh's hands to hear for himself. "Let's go," he said with a firm voice, dropping the radio out of his hands. Josh was barely swift enough to prevent it from hitting the ground. He gave a worried look at Gwen and me, a sign that we should follow Sam. I nodded. In that fog, anyone could get lost, especially Sam. Without thinking, one after the other grabbed each other's hands. All of us were equally scared. Josh displayed it the most. He walked through the white curtain with his eyes closed and holding his breath. "It's okay. The air feels heavy, but it seems fine." He let out his breath at once, and started coughing from inhaling the vapor. After a few minutes of walking through the fog, the light of Sam's phone died down. None of her phones seemed to work anymore. It was as though all power and communications were cut off by the mist that we stood in, a barrier of some sorts. Without a light, we were not going to make it far. The further we got, the thicker it seemed to become. It became hard to see what was in front of you. At that moment, I was glad we hadn't decided to drive into the fog. Accidents were bound to happen at this point. "We're going back, otherwise we got lost," Sam said, taking the lead. Then it dawned on us. None of us recognized where we were. It was almost as if we were no longer on Earth, just walking inside of a dark cloud that not even sunlight could pierce. "And which way would that be, Sam?" Gwen asked him. Not wanting to admit that he was lost, he dragged us along with him, further into the fog. He never answered, though he was determined to protect us in this moment. When the first house was finally visible, the fog seemingly cleared scarcely enough to see what was directly in front of you. Everything was dead silent. Thinking about it, we haven't heard a thing the past half an hour. No birds, nothing, not even people, and that wasn't even the biggest problem. Where were the people? "I don't like this. It feels like a ghost town," Joshua stammered. Gwen put her hand on Josh's shoulder and pointed into the distance. There were figures standing still. The further we looked around, the more we saw. "They are alive," Josh said in a sigh of relief, and wanted to take a sprint to one of the people on the street. He was held back by Gwen, who yanked him back and shook her head. "How sure are you about that, Josh?" Her voice was trembling. My gaze fell upon one of the figures closer to her group. Now I understood what she meant. After taking a good look, I started to wonder if we were even looking at people. It was as if they had started to become one with the fog. Their bodies almost colorless, swaying in a ghastly form in the middle of the streets. There was nothing human about these creatures. Maybe they once were, but that gave a whole new set of questions. What are they then? Did the fog transform them into this? Will we become like them? Are they bringers of the mist? And if they pass the town, they will take the cloud with them? As curious as I am, there was no way I wanted to find the answer. We needed to leave. Quick. Through the fog, something seemed to approach us. Footsteps echoed from across the street. It was the first sound all of us had heard since we stepped into the fog. It was a bizarre thing to behold, but its green light filled us all with fear. A bulb of light swung from left to right like a will-o-wisp, anticipating you to follow it. Sam was the first to act and swung Josh over his shoulder, who was too frightened to move. When he was ready to grab his girlfriend by the hand, she was no longer there. Panicking, he frantically looked around, hoping he hadn't lost a member of the group. However, it was already too late as Gwen stepped forward, enchanted by the light, reaching to whatever it was. "Gwen!" he yelled at the top of his lungs. A light seemed to halt for a moment. Someone was holding that thing, and I was pretty sure it was the source of whatever was going on here. Gwen was too far to reach, so I did what I could do. Grabbed Sam by his shirt and pulled him into the nearest alleyway. He did his best to fight himself free, wanting nothing more than to save his girlfriend, while Josh was still dangling over his shoulder, getting very dizzy. I put Joshua down and wanted to make another sprint back into the open street. It was hard to pull him back, but he eventually collapsed to his knees, crying. As quickly as I could, I covered his mouth as the green light drew near. My heart felt it was racing, as if I had just run a marathon. A prayer slipped from Josh his lips, who sat curled up in the corner against the trash can. If anyone is up there, please hear this prayer. Let the light pass. A light drew closer, and a miracle needed a hand, or rather mine. With my free hand I grabbed the first object I could find, an empty can. I threw it around the corner of the alleyway. All of us froze up, and we saw what looked like a cloaked figure fly by with a staff in his hand. I only saw a glimpse of it, but a crystal was dangling from it. After it passed the alley, Sam took the opportunity to grab both of us by the hand and leave through the other end of the alleyway. On the other side stood a small bus that seemed to have crashed into a lamppost. He pulled us aside and slid the door closed. "What is that thing?" asked Joshua. I was still trying to catch my breath from running. It was truly a wonder that thing didn't end up changing its route and charge after us after we ran out of the alley. No idea, but it is not going to stop us from getting out of here. But first we need to... Sam said, panting. Before he could finish his sentence, I cut him off. "Sam, I understand your feelings, but as long as that thing is looking for us, we can't go looking for Gwen all in the open." With a swift movement, he got up and yanked me by the collar. "If you think I am going to leave my girlfriend behind, then you're a dead wrong, nerd. I love her more than anything in the world. I'm willing to live the end of my days together with her," he said, determined of the rescue mission he'd already started planning. "If you want her back, we need to work together," I answered him with a stern voice. "Fine. What's your plan then?" he said as he slowly let go of my collar and backed down. Josh seemed to calm down a little as well. The poor guy usually would panic when others got into an argument, since he wasn't the loudest in the room, rather a doormat. "Did you see where the light came from?" I asked him, hoping that he would catch on. "We all saw the damn light," he whispered loudly, not wanting to scream since that could blow the cover we currently had. "It's a crystal. If I saw correctly, it's hanging from a staff. If we can break it, we will have the upper hand. Whoever it is holding on to it, it's luring the people to it." And with that, I caught the attention of both of my friends, who continued to listen as I explained the plan in further detail. Josh nodded as I gave everyone their roles, then looked up a little scared and unhappy with the situation he was going to be in. Seeing his realization kick in, it was a funny sight to Sam, who had a hard time keeping his laughter in. "Okay, do both of you understand what we're going to do?" They nodded, and as quickly as we could, we grabbed what we could find within the bus. Everything that seemed heavy enough got stuffed inside bags. As if he had just struck gold, Josh held up something big and started feeling around the object to understand what he was holding. The inside of the van was so dark, it was hard to make out what everything was. Guys, it's a camera! And not a cheap one either, if I'm correct. He put it on the floor beside him and started fumbling around the rest of the van. The walls of the van were covered with electrical devices and screens. I think we are in a broadcasting van, he concluded. The idea of a reporter and their team having been trapped here, like ourselves, gave us shivers. Since the van was empty, we all thought the same thing, without saying it loud. They didn't make it outside the town. You should hold on to that, said Sam. Maybe if we can get out, we can check if it has any footage of what happened. With that, Josh picked the camera back up again and swung the bag over his shoulder. Shall we then? He said. The trembling in his voice was still there, but he seemed more confident of the situation. We're going to end this nightmare. The three of us had somehow made our way to the plaza. I stood at the side with the bags, filled with God knows what. Sam had hidden himself, so he could take action. And Josh? Josh was bait. Cowardly, he stepped forward to the middle of the plaza, looking back in the direction of Sam every once in a while, who kept signing him that it was going to be okay, and he should hurry. When Josh arrived at the place of destination, I grabbed the first thing and threw it into the middle of the square. The sound it made echoed and seemed to disappear after a couple of seconds. A cold sweat had covered my back, but nothing came. The light had not shown itself. I wanted to give it another try, but Sam stood up and blew his cover. A ghostly figure had appeared in the plaza instead. From a distance, it looked like another figure we had seen before, but this one seemed different. "Gwen?" he suddenly yelled, which startled both Joshua and me. Sam leapt forward to embrace his lover, only met by nothing at all. There was no solid being standing in front of him. It was a wonder he still recognized her. A pair of lifeless eyes stared forward, her body swaying like smoke. It felt as if she wanted to say goodbye before she left the world behind. Tears had formed in Sammy's eyes, and he knew he was too late to save her, and there was nothing left. "I'm staying," he said after a long pause. Even though it was impossible, he tried to embrace the figure in front of him. His tears evaporated into the fog. He accepted his fate with a smile on his face as he slowly turned into a figure of the fog. The two internalized in an embrace, forever in the fog. Josh had made his way over to me and put his hand on my shoulder. It was time to go. From the rooftops a light had appeared. It had come after all. We witnessed a flash of green falling from the sky and collapsed to the ground. It stepped towards the middle of the square. The closer it got, the more figures appeared. They seemed to follow the crystal. When it reached the center, it stood still. Josh and I held our breaths. Neither of us knew, if it knew, that we were there. The light shone brighter, and the atmosphere changed. The wind circled around us, and the crystal was heft up high. The fog was being sucked in, and not only that, the figures were forcefully swallowed by the crystal as well. "No!" I screamed, knowing That everyone that once lived in this town was going to be trapped inside. Don't ask me where I got the guts from. My legs moved on their own, and I was headed for the thing, controlling the crystal. Before I could leave a blow with my fist, it disappeared. When I blinked, everything was turned normal. It was day again. Joshua and I stood there in the middle of the square, just staring in disbelief. Our only thing left to do was to go back and leave the now abandoned town. Both of us knew there were no survivors left. The fact that we were still alive to tell the tale was a wonder of its own. The walk back to the car seemed longer than it had been towards the town. Neither of us had the strength left in our bodies, yet we carried on our feet as we stumbled forwards. The police cars were still unmoved, but more cars seemed to have appeared that weren't ours. The thoughts crossed our minds that more neighboring kids, that by now had grown up to be adults, had passed through the mist, almost made me lose my balance. Joshua was luckily there to catch me before I dropped to my knees. We weren't alone, I stuttered. How many have been turned into those things? While we were there. God, only if we knew, we could have saved them, Joshua replied, his gaze back at the town that was in the distance. No, Josh, I don't think we could have. We never had the upper hand. That thing, whatever was holding the crystal, knew what it was doing. I looked up to Josh, trying to meet his gaze. Do you think it will follow us? Turn us into... He was too scared to finish his sentence. It was something I had thought about as well, but I wasn't planning on finding out. Just as I was about to reply, the two-way radio suddenly went off. A flood of screams was emitted from a small object that lied underneath one of the police cars. On a cue, we flew towards the radio to grab a hold of it. Hello? Can someone hear me? I spoke loudly in a panic. The answer never came, as the screams were cut off and the air grew silent once again. The police never believed what happened to us that day. The camera sadly didn't have more footage other than white noise, so that ended up being a failed attempt for evidence. But they still see the town as a mystery, as most people believe everyone just disappeared into thin air. Little do they know, Joshua and I are still uncertain of what we saw, but our friendship has been closer than ever before. We weren't planning on finding out when or how that thing was going to find us, so our mission is to find it first. My friend Joshua believes that if we break the crystal, we might be able to at least set the souls of the people free. That is the plan, and I am positive we can handle it together. After all, we are the people who were forgotten by the fog.